All right, great to see everybody for class this morning. Got a great number. That's very encouraging. I put a new sheet on the back table for next Sunday's study, and there's also a small stack of the notes for today. That's verses 12 through verse 18. And then next Sunday is verses 19 and following, where that section we're all familiar with, where Paul is saying, I'm caught between two positions, whether to live or to die, and I don't know which one is the most advantageous. So that's the section coming up next week. Today we are in verses 12 through verse 18. And if you're looking at the top of the notes, that's going to be lesson number 3. So lesson 3 today, verses 12 through verse 18. We'll give everybody a chance. If you want a copy of the notes, if you need them, grab a copy, and then we'll get started. So be turning your Bible to Philippians chapter 1. Philippians, the first chapter. While they're grabbing copies of that, Art mentioned in his prayer, he mentioned Jessica, and we got a text early this morning, Kurt, saying that she's got inflammation in her stomach, and there's the potential she could end up going to the ER over that. So please pray for Jessica that she'll be okay, and that all that works out. All right, so let's begin by reading verses 12 through verse 18 now of Philippians chapter 1. And this is our section for today, and so we'll go back, and I think we've got about 3 or 4 questions to work through in this section. Verse 12. But I want you to know, brethren, that the things which happened to me have actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel, so that it has become evident to the whole palace guard and to all the rest that my chains are in Christ. And most of the brethren in the Lord, having become confident by my chains, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ even from envy and strife, and some also from goodwill. The former preach Christ from selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my chains. But the latter out of love, knowing that I am appointed for the defense of the gospel. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached, and in this I rejoice, yes, and will rejoice. All right, so here's question number 1. This deals with verse 12. What does Paul mean by the things which happened to me have actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel? What does he mean by that? And how do we typically look at obstacles in life, and how did Paul view obstacles in life? So let's take the first part of that. What does he mean by that? The things that have happened to me have actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel. What's he saying there? Prison? Windows of opportunity, Joel?
I think you got to go back past. Remember, for 2 years he was there. He was in his own rented house.
Yes.
Under guard.
Yep.
Able to receive, so he had
Access.
the impressive centurion that accompanied him.
Yeah.
To Rome.
Yeah. So obviously between all of these, I think obviously everybody's right. We're just all saying bits and parts of the same thing, which is, where is Paul when he writes this letter? All right, he's in prison, and he's saying, even though I'm in prison, what's happened? Yeah, I've actually had, as has been stated, I've had some wonderful opportunities presented in a bad circumstance to, if we can borrow the expression, to make lemonade out of lemons. What we would perceive generally as a really terrible situation has actually worked out with open doors of opportunity. Now, when he begins this in verse 12, he says, I want you to know, brethren. Does that seem to be a pretty common expression Paul uses in his letters? Is he concerned about brethren? He sure seems to be concerned about brethren. This is a concern that he expresses many times. And now he's talking about the Philippians. And I could understand, if I put myself in the shoes of the Philippians, that they might be concerned about Paul. They were concerned about his welfare. Information obviously traveled much differently back then than it does today, right? So this is not just as simple as getting on a cell phone and sending a text message to Paul saying, hey, tell us, how are you doing? it would take a while to get information back. So there would have to be word of mouth, and some messenger or letter carrier would have to bring word from Paul. And if Paul was in jail, then they might be worried about the spread of the gospel. And now not only is he telling them about his status, but he's also telling them about what God did in his current state. Not only that, if you remember just a few weeks ago, like 2 weeks ago, we talked about, and we'll see this in chapter 2, there was a fellow by the name of Epaphroditus who came from Philippi, and they sent Epaphroditus to check on Paul, and he wasn't back yet because he got sick. So obviously information had been delayed, and Paul wants to alleviate their concerns. But he talks about the things which happened, and as you said, I think this is the events leading to and including his imprisonment. And Paul's now telling them this. The main part here is that all of that worked out for the furtherance of the gospel. And the word picture here is a wonderful word picture. The word itself means to cut a path for the army to follow, right? So somebody's out there clearing the way for others to come along. Pioneers cutting a way for an army, so furthering the march of the armies. So this is progress that Paul has made. And Paul said, I owe it to the circumstances, of course to God, to do that. And his point is that in spite of many circumstances which people would often see as a setback, he's actually saying that progress had been made. I think of the passage in Revelation 3. Remember when God was talking to one of the churches in Revelation 3, verses 7 and 8? He said, if God opens a door, what can no man do? No man can shut it. And if God shuts the door, what can no man do? Can't open it, right? If God had opportunities for Paul in Rome when he was in prison, as bad as circumstances we may think that Paul's on arrest, and that's a terrible thing, he should be free, Paul said, God's actually opened some doors, and nobody's been able to shut those doors. So this has turned out for Paul to be a really, really good situation. What is our tendency when it comes to struggles in life, though? What is it? Okay, we try to avoid them. We see struggles as door-closing situations, but how did Paul see it? As a door-opening situation, and we've got to somehow adjust our mindset to where if there's hardship, it's not the worst thing in the world because there are good things that can come out of hardship. Our response generally is to quit and give up, and as Gene said, to try to avoid it altogether. God is constantly challenging our comfort zones, though, is He not? We won't discuss it. Just as a note, read Matthew 14 sometime. Right? You've got the miracle of the walking on the water, and you've got a terrible situation. The boat's being rocked back and forth. It looks like it's going to sink just because of how tumultuous the weather is. The Lord comes walking on the water, and Peter gets out of the boat, and he walks on the water too. And for as much grief as we give Peter for eventually starting to sink in the water, he's the only one who got out of the boat. He stepped out of his comfort zone, and that's one of the lessons we get out of that, is that we have to be uncomfortable for the Lord. Yes, sir.
On this note, I remember in our summer series,
Yeah.
Blackwell talking about his being paralyzed.
Yes.
Opened the door of opportunity for him to convert his physical therapy.
Yeah. Yeah, so, and that could have gone either way. He could have become bitter and given up, but look at all the things that have happened because because Don has decided, even though he's stuck for the rest of his life in a wheelchair, God's opening some doors with that. In fact, it was just this week he's getting ready to start a video vlog. I think he's calling it Truth on Wheels, where he's going to talk about a lot of things, but one of the things he's going to do is try to help people who are struggling with physical situations to understand it's not the end of your life, and you can do great things in that situation. All of us need Paul's attitude. This worked out for good, and we need that attitude. All right, question number 2. What are some of the effects of Paul's imprisonment in verses 13 and 14? We can't often control our circumstances, but we can control the way that we deal with them. How far-reaching is our influence, and how should we treat every situation in life in the context of our influence on others? Listen to verse 13 and 14 again. So it's become evident to the whole palace guard and to all the rest that my chains are in Christ, and most of the brethren in the Lord, having become confident by my chains, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. What has happened because of Paul's imprisonment? What's one thing that happened?
Well, the confidence of the brethren.
Okay, one thing that happened was they watched Paul and they grew more confident, and so now where they might have been reserved to speak the truth to others, they're not afraid to do it anymore because they've been encouraged by Paul. There's another major thing that happened here. What's the other thing? The palace guard has been able to hear the gospel. These are two things that would not have happened without Paul's imprisonment. And so there are some wonderful effects that have come of that. So let's take the first part of that, verse 13. Paul says, it is evident to the palace guard. Yes, Tom?
I would assume that this is the Praetorian Guard.
I believe you're right. I think that's right. I think it is the Praetorian Guard under consideration. Yes. Yeah, there are actually some translations that do translate this Praetorian. In fact, Dennis, do you have NASB or ESV? Which one do you have? ESV. What is ESV? Imperial? Imperial Guard. So that would tell us it's Praetorian Guard. And I think the New American Standard even says Praetorian Guard. Is that what you got there? All right. So, and I think that's probably a better translation because I don't think here it's a reference to the place as much as it was to the people, to the guard here under consideration. But this is definitely a reference to Paul's imprisonment in Rome. I don't think this could be any other imprisonment. The dating and the event suggest a later imprisonment. And like Joel was saying, you read Acts and you can kind of follow his imprisonment as he ends up there. But I think this is a reference to the imperial guards. There's usually a debate right here as to whether it's the place, like the actual palace, or whether it's the guard, the men themselves. So some people take this to be the place, the actual palace of the emperor, and maybe that Paul was somehow maybe in the barracks of the soldiers that were stationed on the northern part of the city. But it sure seems like, based on translation and the way this is flowing, that he's just talking about the men, which would mean that he was still in Rome, like Joel said, on some sort of house arrest, and that he had contact with the imperial guard, that he had some sort of contact with the Praetorian Guard and had some ability to preach to them. Now, yes, exactly. Yes. Yeah, and absolutely. And even when they come out of the burning fiery furnace, they're still able to preach to Nebuchadnezzar and the rest of the royal house as a result of that. So it's just like that in the sense that you got opportunities opening up, and what we would consider throw in the towel situations. Paul said, look what I've been able to do as a result of this. I've been able to preach just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Very good point. Now, in verse 13, when he says, okay, we get the palace guard, when he says, all the rest, who would all the rest be? Okay, anybody else that came in contact? If Paul was on house arrest, and he probably had some folks from the Praetorian Guard that were kind of watching over Paul, all the rest could indicate who? The rest of the Praetorian Guard. And we know for a fact in history there were about 9,000 of them stationed on the northern part of the city. So Paul's saying potentially I had the chance to preach to the rest of them, or through the men that I had contact with, the rest of them. So Paul's preaching through his imprisonment had affected the Praetorian Guard, because they were all aware that according to verse 13, that his chains were in Christ, meaning that what did they know about the reason that he was there? He was there for no other reason than he had preached the truth, and he got put in prison because he was preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. But someone else also mentioned, verse 14, it was emboldening the church. The church was being strengthened as a result of this. So, and I think he's talking about when he says in verse 14, most of the brethren in the Lord have become confident by my chains. He's writing to the Philippians. I think he's talking about the church in Rome has been given voice to speak up and speak out. Gene?
The Greek word that's used there literally means headquarters.
Yeah.
It'd be the equivalent of our headquarters.
Yeah, I mean, it was the epicenter.
There were thousands.
Yes. Yeah, thousands and thousands, which is an amazing opportunity for sure. So Paul's courage gave them the courage to speak, which means that no matter the circumstances, they were willing to speak the truth without fear because they had been so emboldened by Paul to do that. Yes, sir.
Well, it goes to the same mindset as far as building confidence.
Exactly.
More experienced or
100%.
go knock on the door, they would go with them.
Yep.
And through that, they could build confidence.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And that's absolutely. Sometimes you need to see somebody being brave before you can be brave, or you need to see somebody doing evangelism before you can do it. Joe, your hand's kind of...
I think it's interesting, there's only one name that we know that he converted while in Rome, and that's Onesimus.
Yes.
So he sought Paul out
Mm-hmm.
for some reason. So Paul, obviously, they knew where to find him.
Yeah, absolutely. They must have known somehow how to do that. And Epaphroditus was obviously able to find him somehow, so they knew exactly how to be in contact, and so did the other Christians who were there. I think there's an overarching message here in this. All of us have influence. Okay, you either have good influence or you have bad influence, but we all have influence, right? At all times, we all have influence. What are we learning from Paul here about influence?
What you do and what you say is very important. You're going to
Even in bad situations? Yeah, exactly.
be an example to someone
Yeah.
for either good or bad.
Yes.
We don't live on an island. Everything we do, for the most part, affects other people.
100%. Yeah. Paul was in a really terrible situation. If he handled that the way that most of us handle bad situations in life, would he have had the ability to preach to as many as he did? No. But because of the way he treated the situation, this is an opportunity from God to do something good. It obviously had a resounding positive influence on the people who were there, and look what happened as a result of that. Hold your place real quick. I just want to remind us of two things. Go to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5. Tommy was just saying, we're not an island, right? It's not as though our lives are detached from everybody else that's around us. We are connected by our influence, either for good or for bad, what Tommy was saying. So look at Matthew chapter 5. Look at verse 13. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It's then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot of men. You are the light of the world, a city that is set on a hill that cannot be hidden. Neither do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. So even though Paul was in a really dark place situationally, what was he still to the Romans? The light of the world and the salt of the earth. And he was the shining light up there, right? So all of us are put in that situation every single day. Now, one more passage. Look at Galatians chapter 2. Galatians chapter 2. And I'm kind of building on what Tommy was saying there about it matters how you act around other people. It's tough. We all struggle with it. But look at Galatians 2. One verse, verse 20. I've been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. So if our profession is Christ lives in me, do you think people take an extra scrupulous look at Christians in whatever situation they're in to see whether Christ is really living in us? And apparently, when they take that investigation like they did of Paul, what did they see in Paul? That his bonds were where? He's got Christ living in him. And he obviously had an amazing impact on some of the people who were there because they were able to assess that here's a guy who's been given dealt a really bad hand, and look what he's done with it. And so all of us have that opportunity, right? We can be bitter or, off-putting. We can be sulking and grumbling about our situations in life, or we can be kind and respectful and convicted and hopeful. And the influence that comes from that versus the other is great. It's positive. Any other thoughts on that? I think this is a great lesson from Paul. He's certainly reminding the Philippians, but he's telling us that too, that all of us have the ability to do that. All right, so, yeah, one more thing.
I want to say, if a person is humble, trying to do the right thing, their actions are important to them, and they're striving to do the right thing.
We live in a victim culture. Everybody's a victim, and so everybody's offended by everything instead of just being mature and acting the right way. Tom?
Back to verse 13, 14.
Yes.
I take that to mean that the brethren, seeing that the Praetorian Guard is, I think, deferential to you. Sort of what I think.
Yeah.
That's what emboldens them.
Yeah.
If the Praetorian Guard is deferential to you, then you've got nothing to do.
Yeah. And they must have gained some sort of inroads with people in positions of authority to sort of remove that fear. That's a good point. All right, so this comes, now verses 15 through 18 is our last question, and I do want to spend the last of our morning here because I think this is hard. This is a tough thing for us to do. But listen to what Paul says in verses 15 through 18. Some are preaching Christ out of envy and strife, some out of goodwill, and yet Paul is able to say at the end, I'm happy as long as they're preaching Christ. So here's the question. What does Paul mean that some preach Christ even from envy and strife? Verses 15 through 18. Why would anybody do that? And how should we preach Christ? What was Paul's attitude toward insincere preachers in chapter 1, verse 18? And how is it even possible to have such a mindset? What are your thoughts on this?
Okay, here's first opinion again. I think it's impossible to say exactly. However, I think it gives a clue. Because I don't think he wastes words and he addresses the chapter 8 with mutilation. Those brethren
Yes,
within the church who are still saying, but yes, you still got to be circumcised.
right.
Now here he is in prison. A wonderful time for us to create strife, and we're jealous of the effects he's had. That's
Yeah, I'd agree he's probably still talking about Judaizers because they seem to be the most besetting people in the church toward him.
they were within the church.
Yeah, that's right. Christians who are doing, yeah. And whoever it is, he says in verse 15, they're preaching Christ. So these are probably, members of the church. I would agree with that. But obviously something's going on with motives here, Tommy.
Well, he's actually saying, and what he's not saying, he's saying that it's great that Christ is being put out there
Yep.
so people can be exposed to it. But we know from what Paul has done and said and thought and the rest of it, he's not happy with the way they went about it.
That's right.
But the consequences would be that they put Christ out.
Yep. Is there any indication in verses 15 through 18 that his opposition is to the content of their preaching? Is he concerned that they're teaching false doctrine? Look at verse 15. What are they preaching? Christ. Is that his objection? What's his objection? It's how they're doing it. It's the attitude behind it. So the message seems to be okay, but they're doing it with the expressed purpose of doing what to Paul? They're trying to bring more difficulty to Paul's life by the preaching of the gospel. They're still preaching the gospel, like Tommy was saying, but what they were doing was doing it in such a way as to try to make Paul's life harder, which goes back to what Joel was saying, those Judaizing teachers. There appear to be two groups of people in Rome. Some of those who were appreciative of Paul and some who didn't like Paul at all, and that seems to be what he's addressing here. Gene?
Well, he talks about selfish ambition.
Yep.
I'm sure there were people there who saw the influence he had on the Praetorian Guard.
Oh, yes.
And all the officials, and they said, oh, this is the way you get in good stance with all of those people.
Yes.
So I'll preach the gospel so I can get ahead in life, not for the right reason,
Yeah.
but out of selfish ambition.
Absolutely. So what is envy? Let's talk about those words that Gene was just talking about. Let's see, he said some preach Christ in envy. What's envy? Yes, jealousy. It's the feeling of displeasure produced by witnessing the advantage that someone else has. And like Gene was just saying, they're looking at all that Paul was able to accomplish. And there was some real jealousy on the part of these people toward Paul. What is strife? What is it? Yeah, division, contention. I do not know this. Don't mark me down as saying it because I don't know. But there is in the word strife a very physical side to the definition of that word. And I don't know for a fact, but I'm curious whether when they said they preach envy out of strife, if whether their intention was to bring physical harm to Paul as a result of their jealousy. I don't know that, but the word here could include that. In verse 16, he says that they do it from selfish ambition and not sincerely. And of course, the word selfish ambition means out of self-interests, like the word would be used of a hireling. You know, you're just not doing it out of pure motive. But they're not sincere, meaning that they have impurity mixed in with the motive of their preaching. What Paul is saying in principle is this: you cannot be right in what you say and be wrong in your heart and the whole thing be right. Right? So you can't stand up in a pulpit or in a classroom or in daily evangelism and say the right thing out of an impure heart and still be correct, because the whole thing is wrong. Because God wants not only what we do to be right, what does He also want to be right? He wants the heart to be right. Did you have your hand up, Bobby?
I was just going to say Diotrephes.
Yes, Diotrephes. Yeah, kind of. He was a troublemaker, and we don't know what he was teaching that was wrong, but his heart certainly wasn't right. Yeah, jealous of John for sure. But these brethren clearly wanted to hurt Paul in some way by the preaching of the gospel. But it is a warning. It is a warning to preachers, and I think this goes back to what Gene was just saying. It's a warning to any teacher, right? Any teacher. The goal of preaching is not to elevate self. What's the goal of preaching? To elevate Christ. Right, so they're preaching Christ, but that's not who they were really trying to elevate. Because when Paul says they do it out of selfish ambitions, it means they were really wanting to push themselves up, and they were using Christ to get there. So I think that was a great observation by Gene a moment ago. Now, in contrast, in verse 17, others are preaching Christ out of what? Out of love. They're doing it out of love. Goodwill toward God and goodwill toward Paul. Love toward God and love toward Paul. But these are people in verse 17 that knew God's place for Paul, and they knew that Paul was set for the defense of the gospel. What's that mean, the defense of the gospel? It's the word from which we get our English word apologetics. And so some people read this word apologia and they say, well, that means Paul was sorry for the truth. That's not what it means. What was he doing? He was explaining it and defending it. That's what Paul was doing here. And the people who preached the truth out of love knew as they preached it that Paul was willing to defend the truth. All right, so that brings us to verse 18. And this is the tough part out of all of this in verse 18. Paul says, what then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached. And in this I rejoice, yes, and will rejoice. What was his attitude? What was it, Miss Jo? If Paul is saying, if the truth is taught, I'm going to rejoice that truth is being taught. How could he say that knowing that their motives were not right? How could he say that? Because obviously we should share that same attitude, but how do you do that if someone's motive is not sincere, but if they're preaching the truth, Tommy?
Normally, if people are normal, they're going to be able to see through that.
I think so.
They're going to be able to see what they're saying is true, but they're also going to be able to see the attitude that the people have.
Yeah.
And, I personally, I've experienced that over the years.
Yeah. So in one sense, they're going to expose themselves, so he doesn't have to bring out anything more than saying they're preaching the truth, and eventually their lies are going to get unfolded before people. So I think that's a good point. What else? Anything else?
Even though they're not right in their heart,
Right.
they're still getting the word out.
Yes. So if somebody were to stand up, and we don't know this person's heart, but somebody were to, like say we invite somebody here, and in their heart, we don't know that they've just they're disinterested and they're not even concerned anymore about truth, and they're elevating themselves, right? They're trying to push themselves. And we don't know that, but they preach a truthful message about the church or baptism. What was Paul's response to that? I'm thankful the truth was taught this morning about baptism. I'm thankful the truth was taught about the church. But it's still tough, isn't it? Because Paul knew that their motives weren't right, and yet he was still saying, as long as Christ is preached, I'm going to glory in that. I'm going to rejoice in that. Joel, you see your hand sort of up there?
Don't you know, I don't have anyone in mind, but in all the congregations in 50 days,
Sure.
has to be a minister of.
Don't you know it?
Jealous of someone.
Yep.
Or teaching his own. I mean, I don't know.
No, but this is not an isolated incident. I agree with you completely. This is not an isolated thing. There are lots of people who stand in classrooms, in pulpits, and do teach the truth, but their heart's not in it. You know that has to happen.
Human nature doesn't change. If Paul was dealing with this back then, we can be assured that there are those
100%.
today that are on the
Yeah.
same way.
Yeah.
Because people don't change like that.
Yeah. When Paul says in verse 18, only that in every way, whether in pretense or truth, Christ is preached, we know that he's not talking now about the content of their preaching, because were there other occasions when Paul would directly expose people whose content was messed up? Yeah. Look at this one. Look at 1 Timothy chapter 1, just as an example. 1 Timothy chapter 1. 1 Timothy chapter 1. Go down to the end of 1 Timothy chapter 1, look at verse 19. He says, having faith and a good conscience, which some having rejected concerning the faith have suffered shipwreck, of whom are Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I've delivered to Satan, that they may learn not to blaspheme. Was he concerned about what they were teaching? Yeah. Look at 2 Timothy. Look at chapter 2. 2 Timothy chapter 2. 2 Timothy 2, look at verse 17. And their message will spread like canker in the Old King James, cancer, New King James. Hymenaeus and Philetus are of this sort, who have strayed concerning the faith or the truth, saying that the resurrection is already past, and they overthrow the faith of some. When somebody taught error, Paul never failed to expose the error that they were teaching, which makes me confident that in Philippians chapter 1, this was not an issue of them teaching error. They were teaching the truth. Their heart just wasn't in it. And here is the truth about that. If someone is insincere in what they're teaching, but teaching the truth, while they may get away with that upon the earth, is there one day going to be a reckoning for that? And is it possible for us to say, as long as the truth is being taught, and I agree with what Tommy was saying, if you find out that somebody by their actions are being insincere, that's one thing, right? Because we can be fruit inspectors. But if we never know, then I can still delight in the truth being preached. I can love that truth is being taught, and God will take care of whatever needs to be taken care of on the last day. And I think that's part of what's behind Paul's motive as well. God will take care of motives on the last day, but we should always delight in the pure gospel being taught. Now, somewhere along the way, if somebody has a really bad attitude, it tends to affect the message that's being preached, and sometimes the message gets corrupted as a result of that. Is this a hard thing to do? It's hard, right? Because you would think Paul would just, he would say they ought not be doing that, but yet he's able to say they're preaching the truth, and for that I'm thankful. And why would he be so thankful that the message is being preached? What happens when the seed is planted? You get a product of Christianity, and Paul sees the potential for even Christianity being brought out of what they're doing, even though their motive was not correct. Any thoughts on this section? I think this is probably verses 12 through 18 is a section that we struggle with, from the sense that we tend to treat circumstances very poorly and our influence suffers, but Paul didn't do that, so we can learn from that. And then also from the standpoint in verses 15 through 18, that we should always, absolute joy should be in the gospel. We love the gospel so much that anytime the truth is preached, we can delight in the truth, even if motives aren't where they need to be. Any other thoughts on that? Yeah, Dennis?
The ESV says in verse 15,
Yeah.
indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry.
Yeah, I think rivalry is probably a better, because it gives a better sense of what was going on. They really did not like Paul. And I think Joel's probably right in that these are Judaizing teachers in the church. But clearly in every letter he struggled against these brethren. The book of Acts shows they were after him all the time because they sort of teamed up with Jews in the community. But rivalry is a really good translation there. Any thoughts on this? All right, put a peg in it there. My favorite section, one of my favorite in Philippians is the next section. Okay, it's one of two of my favorite sections in Philippians. And Paul is going to say, if I live or if I die, I can see the blessing in either one of those. But that's not normally how we deal with the choice of life or death. And sometimes we're so focused on the living or the death and the the fear of death, it doesn't really allow us to live like Paul lived. So let's talk about that next week. If you didn't get a copy of the notes, now would be a good time to do that as we dismiss class. Thanks, guys. Appreciate your input so much. Good talk.